Before I begin, I want to invite you to picture a river. It might be one you once have been seen before, a river that was gentle or restless, or simply moving at its own quiet pace. Hold that image for a moment. I am Wu Kexi, and I grew up near one of China's great waterways, the Yangtze River, in a city that sits beside Taihu. When you live close to water, you do not just observe it from a distance. It shapes you. You learn that everything in the world is connected by some form of movement. A river teaches you that nothing travels alone, that every journey is part of large flow, and that connection is not a concept, but rhythm that life naturally follows. In China, rivers carry an even deeper meaning. They are often called the mothers of our civilization. They nurtured our earliest communities, carried stories and grain and hope, and witnessed how generations survived and flourished along their banks. When we look to a river, we are not only looking at the water, we are looking at memory, identity, and continuity. This is why I began my talk with the river. Not only because it is beautiful or ancient, but because it is the clearest way I know to share what connection means to me. Connection begins in the moment something starts to move, whether it is a thought, a story, a gesture, or quietening of a current. Today, I want to share how one river shaped my understanding of China, how it shaped my understanding of the world, and how it led me to believe the two can meet and follow together. During the long rainy season along the Yangtze River last summer, I was in Changzhou doing field work on a digital oversight system. One afternoon, while I was moving from house to house for interviews, the sky opened in that sudden and unapologetic way only monsoon rain knows. A villager standing outside his home and saw me struggling with my standing notes and called out, inviting me to wait under the eaves. We stood there for a moment. Water steaming off the tiled roof, the ground turning glossy with rain, and he began to tell me how much everyday life had changed since launch of the 12345 service platform. He said that in the past, small problems could take days to solve. You had to travel to the township office, wait in the long queues, chase down the right person. Now he could report a broken street light, resolve a land issue, or request support for aging parents with a single phone call. He looked at me and said something simple yet powerful. For the first time, someone always listens. Our voices actually land somewhere. Then he pointed out towards the river swollen with rain and laughed. He told me that even their fish had gone digital. Their online fisheries management system tracks water quality, breeding cycles, and river safety in real time, so families can rely on the river not just for tradition, but for livelihood security. As he talked, I realized how naturally his story followed from one part of life to another. Once he started, he kept going. He spoke about how his grandchildren could enroll in school without a maze of paperwork, how elderly neighbors could book medical appointments through a simple interface, how families could manage pensions and insurance with clarity they never had before. Everything he described felt like part of the same current moving quietly but steady toward a better life. Standing under the small roof, watching the rain soften into mist, I realized how different this was from the way we usually talk about technology. We often jumped straight to the impressive part, the big numbers, the breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, or next generation community systems. But he reminded me that none of it matters until it reaches a village road, a kitchen table, a cracked smartphone held by someone who has never tapped an email. When I saw the day was not a story about data, but a story about people, about how innovation can carry warmth when it is shaped around real lives and real needs. As the rain eased and the rivers were just a little from the storm, it struck me that connection is only about how people relate to one another or how China speaks to the world. Connection is also about the long, often visible way technology finds its path to humanity, the way it follows through a community like water, changing things quietly, patiently, and in ways that matter. In the story from Changzhou shows how digital tools can follow into everyday life. But now, I want to take you further down the river to a place that connection feels even more alive. I want to bring you to the banks of Lianjiang River in Guangdong Province. When I first arrived there, the air felt heavy with summer heat and the river moved slowly, almost as if it was carrying the thoughts of the people who lived beside it. I was in a small town called Qixing, doing field work on rural revitalization, and the villagers welcomed me with the kind of warmth that makes you forget you are a researcher. They want me to know the pride of their community, a bright yellow watermelon that has become famous across China. Many of them still plant it in the way their grandparents did, but now with better irrigation, stronger cooperatives, and new ways to bring their harvest to the world. One of the farmers handed me a slice. It was crisp, sweet, and unbelievably. He pointed to the river and said, "It starts there. The soil, the water, and the sun. The river raises watermelon the same way it raises us." I love that sentence, river raises us. The villagers told me how their melons now travel far beyond Guangdong. They are sold in cities across China, and some batches reach Southeast Asia. A few even made it to Europe. As they said, all with a mixture of disbelief and joy, because this journey is more than economic progress. It is a reminder that something grew in a quiet corner of that country can begin a story that travels across continents. But the part that stayed with me was not only the success of the fruit. It was what it did to people. Qixing is home to several ethnic communities. For years, many young people left to work in factories. But as the watermelon industry grew, they started coming back. Families began planting side by side. Different groups learned to share tools, knowledge, and hopes. The river that once separated farmlands now seemed to connect people. So one village leader told me, "When we work together, the river feels younger." I still think about that. A river feeling younger is another way of seeing that a community feels alive again. Standing there, listening to them, I realized a chapter of China's story the world often does not see. It is not about slogans. It is not about grand narratives. It is about people who look at the land beneath their feet and decide to build something better. It is about sweetness grown from hard soil become sweetness tasted by people thousands of miles away. It is a people's story, a story rooted in the belief that a good life is made together. And if you listen closely, you can hear the same message that the river carried back in Guangzhou. Connection is not something that happens only in the conference halls or global forums. It begins at the water's edge. It begins with the lives that follow into one another. It begins when people believe that their stories can move, expand, and reach places they have never seen. And in Qixing, a watermelon was already took to remind that connection does not have to be complicated. Sometimes it is simply something sweet, grown by many hands, carried downstream and shared with the world. As I kept traveling along different rivers in China, these moments stay with me. The laughter under the eaves in Guangzhou, the sweetness of watermelon in Qixing, the way people talk about their lives with such openness. They became part of my memory in a world I did not expect. And of course, China, what I have seen about, is even larger than the two places. I spent the summer teaching in Inner Mongolia, while children asked questions about were far bigger than the classroom. I interviewed families in Shandong, where fishermen let me step into the boat, but I even clearly did not have the balance for it. I visited many corners of the country and found the same quiet warmth again and again. These experiences made me more aware of something. As a young person in China, I hold stories that feel small, but they are true. And I realized that sharing them honestly is a responsibility, not in a heavy way, but in a very human way. There was one moment at an international conference on sustainable development that helped me understand this. When it was my turn, I did not try to adjust my tone or sound something technical. I simply shared what I knew. I talk about the story I have learned from the field work, like who felt seen because a public service platform, and I talk about the farmers in Guangdong who measure a season by the winners of the sweetness of watermelon rather than by economic data. They were short stories, but they were real. Nothing dramatic happened after I finished, but I felt calm. It was the first time I realized that when I speak in international spaces, my job is not to represent everything or everyone. It is simply to bring one small piece of truth from the places I have been. This is enough, and maybe it is our own way of connection. After the meeting, I began paying closer attention on how young people from different parts of the world talk about their own communities. Over the past few years, I have had the chance to speak with youth from more than 35 countries in programs I joined and in programs I helped organize. During these exchanges, I was simply one person sharing what I have seen along China's rivers and listening to what others have seen along rivers. And every time someone said, "This reminds me of home," I felt a small bridge being built. Quite simple, but very real. These conversations told me something I could not have learned alone. Connection does not begin with agreement, it begins with recognition. When you offer something true about where you're from and someone else feels safe enough to offer something true back, that is when the world becomes a little smaller and a little closer. When I look back about all these experiences, the image that stays with me most clearly is still the river. Rivers never move in a straight line. They turn, slow down, and they gather strength again. They carry stories from one bank to another, from one generation to the next. And in many ways, this is how I see China's journey. It is a long follow of people who continue to build, to learn, and to pass something forward. Every euro adds its own bend in the river. Every community shapes the current in its own way. Rivers connect places that never meet, and in the same way, ideals and values and hopes travel further than we imagine. They follow from the United Nations in New York to IRDR office in Beijing, from a youth forum in Geneva to a village road in Guangdong. Sometimes they move through formal agreements, but more often they move quietly, through conversations between people who are simply trying to understand one another. That is where my hope comes from, not from the big series or the big stages, but from these 3 moments. When someone listens with sincerity, when a story shared by a stranger feels unexpectedly familiar. When we realize that our lives, though shaped by different histories, still move to a similar rhythm. If the river have taught me anything, it is this. And as long as our rivers continues to move forward, so can we. We can let understanding travel with them. We can help the world feel less divided. And in our own small but irreplaceable ways, we can bring the shores closer until the distance between us is no longer something to fear, but something we have learned to cross. Thank you.